My mother raised her champagne flute toward my brother the evening she handed him the keys to an $875,000 Calgary condo. Then she reached below the white linen tablecloth, pulled out a water-stained envelope, and dropped it directly onto my dinner plate. Inside was the deed to 40 acres of desolate land near Drayton Valley, Alberta, along with a $34,000 municipal tax notice marked past due. She leaned forward, close enough that I could smell her perfume, and told me in a low voice that if I didn't sign the transfer papers before the end of the month, I would be permanently removed from our father's estate. She sat back and waited for me to fall apart. Across the table, my sister-in-law was already smiling. I picked up the pen, I signed my name, and I did not shed a single tear, because I already knew something about that piece of land, something that was going to change every single one of their lives in ways they never anticipated. My name is Cara. I'm 29 years old. I'm a hydrogeologist, which means I study groundwater systems and soil composition for a living. To my family, that translated roughly to, she plays in the dirt for work and isn't embarrassed about it. Before I go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever been the one your family underestimated, the one handed the mess while someone else got the prize, hit like and subscribe. This story is for you. I grew up in Calgary, Alberta, in a household where appearances were the primary currency. My mother ran her social life like a campaign, and my father, a quiet man who spent 30 years in the petroleum industry, funded it without complaint. He died 8 months before the dinner I just described, and with him went the only person in our family who ever looked at my work and said it actually mattered. My brother is 7 years older than me. He spent most of his adult life brokering natural gas contracts and wearing it like a personality. By 36, he had cultivated exactly the kind of lifestyle that photographs well on LinkedIn. A glass-walled office on the 14th floor of a building in the financial core, a wardrobe that cost more than my first car, and a wife who treated every restaurant like an audition for a show nobody had asked her to star in. My sister-in-law had built a career in real estate staging, which meant she had opinions about every room she walked into and zero hesitation about sharing them. The dinner was held at a restaurant with exposed brick and a wine list the length of a short novel. My mother had booked the private dining room. She said it was to celebrate her birthday and discuss the early distribution of my father's estate. What she actually meant was that she had already decided everything and wanted an audience while she announced it. My brother received his envelope first. My mother slid it across the table with both hands, like she was presenting an award. She talked about his business acumen, his presence in the industry, the kind of address a man of his standing deserved. He kissed her cheek. My sister-in-law clutched the envelope against her chest and looked at me the way people look at someone who just lost a competition they were never told they were entering. Then my mother reached under the table. The envelope she handed me was not cream. It was yellowish and soft at the corners, the kind of paper that has been handled too many times by too many anxious hands. Inside was the deed to a property I had never heard of, a 40-acre parcel outside Drayton Valley, registered under something called Ridgewater Holdings, Inc. There were also several overdue letters from the county of Brazeau and a municipal tax notice for $34,000, flagged as past due. The printed satellite image showed flat, brownish land, a gravel access road, and what appeared to be 3 concrete well pads going nowhere in particular. My sister-in-law looked at it, tilted her head, and said that honestly, given my background, a patch of Alberta scrubland seemed like a very natural for me. She said it the way someone says something they've been rehearsing, with that particular flatness designed to pass as casual. I felt the comment settle somewhere in my chest. I didn't respond to it. My mother explained that our father had purchased the land years earlier through a small holding company, that it had generated nothing but property tax bills ever since, and that it was time for someone to deal with it. She crossed her arms. She said if I refused the transfer, she would contest my share of the remaining estate, and I would walk away with nothing. She told me to decide now, in this restaurant tonight. My brother refilled his wine and suggested I stop making it awkward. I looked down at the documents, I read the legal description, I read the name of the corporation, Ridgewater Holdings, Inc., and something clicked very quietly in the back of my mind. A detail I had filed away from a professional bulletin I'd read 2 years earlier. I kept my face completely still. I signed. I left $40 on the table for my sparkling water and drove home through the dark streets of Calgary thinking about something I had read in an Alberta Energy Regulator technical notice. I was almost certain Not completely, not yet, that I already knew exactly why my mother was so eager to get Ridgewater Holdings out of her name. I drove to Drayton Valley the next morning, 3 hours through flat canola country and then river valley terrain. The gravel road leading to the property was unmarked. My GPS gave up about half a kilometer before I arrived. The land was not what you would call welcoming. The soil near the access road was stained a gray-brown color I recognized immediately, the kind of discoloration that happens when hydrocarbons have been leaking into the ground for years undisturbed. The grass was pale and stunted. Near the back of the property, barely visible through the scrub brush, I could make out the concrete pads of 2 capped oil wells, and beside them, a third well that was not capped. Its wellhead was rusted and weeping a thin dark fluid into the soil around it. I sat in my car, I opened my laptop, I pulled up the Alberta Energy Regulator's public database and searched the land title and the company name. It took less than 4 minutes to confirm everything. Ridgewater Holdings Inc. was registered as the operator of record for all 3 inactive oil wells on the property. 2 had been flagged as non-compliant with mandatory abandonment requirements. The third, the one I could see leaking from my windshield, had been designated by the Orphan Well Association as a priority remediation site. The AER had issued formal enforcement orders to Ridgewater Holdings 3 times in the past 2 years. There was an outstanding remediation demand totaling an estimated $2.3 million in mandatory cleanup costs, with potential charges under the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act cited in the most recent correspondence. The language used was not gentle. My mother had received every one of those letters as executor of my father's estate. She had known exactly what Ridgewater Holdings was. She had handed me a corporation carrying $2.3 million in regulatory debt and the very real possibility of environmental negligence charges. And she had done it with a birthday dinner as the backdrop, surrounded by white linen and good champagne, waiting for me to crumble. I sat there looking at the uncapped wellhead for a long time. I am not going to pretend I wasn't hurt. I was. The specific pain of understanding that your own parent would rather see you charged with a provincial offense than absorb a consequence herself is not something that washes off quickly. I let myself feel it, fully, for about 15 minutes. Then I closed the laptop, started the engine, and pulled back onto the highway. The version of me who spent years quietly rearranging herself to earn my mother's approval was finished. What replaced her was something considerably clearer and colder. I was a scientist. I knew how to read contaminated soil, and as it turned out, I also knew how to read a land registry. I paid the $34,000 municipal tax bill 3 days later by bank draft. The clerk looked at me with something like sympathy. I smiled, thanked her, and asked if she could also pull the provincial tender listings for nearby agricultural parcels. There was a 120-acre block of clean river-bottom farmland going to public auction the following month, adjacent to the Ridgewater property on the eastern side. The soil profile I'd seen from the road was exceptional. Rich, undisturbed, perfectly suited for the kind of controlled environment operation I had been designing in my head for 3 years. I registered a new corporation through a registered agent, Cedar Ridge Organics Inc. My name appeared nowhere in the public-facing records. I placed a sealed bid on the clean farmland. I won it for $480,000, nearly all of my savings from 6 years of consulting work, plus a small business loan from an Alberta Treasury branch. By spring, I had broken ground on a certified organic specialty mushroom and microgreen greenhouse. I hired a farm manager named Greta, who had spent 15 years running a cooperative greenhouse in the Fraser Valley before moving back to Alberta. She was extraordinarily capable. I paid her accordingly and gave her the operational latitude she deserved. What most people don't know about organic specialty mushrooms is that they move fast. Oyster mushrooms go from inoculation to harvest in 3 weeks, lion's mane in 4. And the culinary market in Calgary and Edmonton, for anything certified organic, grown locally and traceable, had been quietly underserved for years. Greta had chefs calling her directly within the first month. I also leased 50 acres of the open land to a solar development firm out of Red Deer. Alberta's electricity grid had been shifting steadily, and solar lease agreements in the province had become genuinely valuable. The lease payments alone covered operating costs. I blocked my family on every platform. For 6 months, I did not speak to my mother, my brother, or my sister-in-law. I did not answer emails. I did not pick up calls from the Calgary area code. I worked from sunrise until dark, and the silence of those months was the first real peace I could remember since my father died. My brother's situation deteriorated quickly once there was no one close to him managing consequences. The details reached me later through a cousin with the grace to stay out of it. His brokerage collapsed after a natural gas futures position went badly wrong. He'd lost most of his liquid assets. The condo my mother had given him was mortgage-free, but condominiums in that district carry significant monthly obligations: strata fees, maintenance contributions, reserve fund levies, and without income, $4,100 a month disappears fast. He borrowed against the condo's equity to recover losses. That made things considerably worse. When his credit line was frozen, my sister-in-law's cards began declining in public places. She described the experience in detail later on the internet. A boutique on 17th Avenue was where it happened. She called my brother from the sidewalk. He told her about the accounts. She drove home and sat in the underground parking garage for 45 minutes before going upstairs. They moved into my mother's house in Calgary shortly afterward. They told her it was a strategic pause while the market corrected. My mother accepted this completely. She had structured her entire identity around my brother's perceived success, and admitting otherwise would have required admitting she had been wrong about him for most of his adult life. She was not built for that. What she was built for, after 2 months of feeding them and watching her accounts drain, was calling me. The landline from my childhood home appeared on my phone one afternoon while I was reviewing greenhouse expansion numbers with Greta. I answered out of pure curiosity. I wanted to hear exactly how desperate things had become. She didn't ask how I was. She launched directly into a speech about family obligation and my brother's temporary cash flow challenge. She wanted me to take a loan against the Drayton Valley property and wire $34,000 to my brother by the end of the following week. To save the family's reputation, she said. I asked her why he didn't simply sell the condo. She told me that was absolutely out of the question. He needed the address for professional credibility. She said I was selfish and petty and jealous of a success I had never worked hard enough to earn myself. She was still talking when I pressed end. I found out afterward that she stood in her kitchen for a moment holding the disconnected phone, not speaking. My sister-in-law, who had been listening from the hallway, sat down with her laptop and searched my name in the Alberta Business Registry and on Google. She was expecting to find creditor filings, overdue accounts, maybe a bylaw violation from the county. Evidence of my failure. She planned to print it and mail it to me as a reminder of where I stood. She found instead a feature article published 2 weeks earlier in Alberta Venture magazine. The headline read, "The Quiet Revolution: How One Scientist Turned Prairie Soil into Alberta's Most Talked About Organic Operation." There was a photograph of me in full morning light, standing in front of the Cedar greenhouse in my work clothes, arms loosely crossed, looking directly at the camera. Behind me, the gabled roofline of the greenhouse stretched back into a pale blue October sky. The article estimated Cedar Ridge Organics at a current valuation of $4.2 million. Contracts across 2 provinces, solar lease revenue, expansion underway. My sister-in-law read the valuation line 3 times, then she carried the laptop to the kitchen and set it on the island in front of my mother and brother. The room went quiet in a way that by all accounts was worse than shouting. My mother studied the photograph. She looked at the greenhouse. She looked at the rolling land behind it. She decided something, and the thing she decided was wrong. She assumed the Cedar Ridge facility was built on the Ridgewater property. She did not consider that there might be a separate parcel, a separate company, a separate 40 acres of clean farmland that she had never known existed. She saw Alberta countryside and a valuation with a 4 in front of it, and she concluded she had accidentally given away a gold mine. My brother's logic was simpler. He decided the business belonged to him because the original land had come from our father. They packed the car that same evening. I have cameras on every entrance to the Cedar Ridge property. I was in the South Bay with Greta when the notification came through. A dark SUV bypassing the open delivery gate and continuing up the main access road. I watched the feed for a moment. I told Greta I needed to step inside and asked her to continue without me. By the time I came through the back entrance, they had been inside 11 minutes. My mother was at the kitchen island examining the undersides of my ceramic mugs for price marks. My brother was at my desk in the farm office, working through the drawers with the focus of someone who believes they are conducting due diligence. My sister-in-law was in the open plan workspace explaining to Greta that the facility's layout was inefficient and would need complete reconfiguration once the new management team arrived. She spoke to Greta slowly and with exaggerated clarity, in the particular tone some people use when they have already decided the person in front of them is there to receive instructions rather than give them. I stood in the doorway with my arms at my sides and watched. My brother held up a binder from my filing cabinet and said the revenue structure was actually quite solid and he might be willing to keep me on in an advisory role once he'd had a chance to properly assess the operation. My mother looked up from the mug and said I had done an adequate job preparing the family property and that she and my brother would be taking over operations as soon as the paperwork was in order. I thanked her. I told Greta she was free for the afternoon with full pay. Then I offered to make coffee. I needed them settled. I needed them certain. The binder I had left accessible in my desk drawer referenced Ridgewater Holdings Inc. in careful, general language, professional enough to look like it belonged, vague enough that someone reading with greed, rather than attention, would not notice the absence of a specific civic address matching the greenhouse. My brother did not notice. He didn't ask for a property survey. He didn't ask to see the parcel descriptions. He wanted the revenue numbers, which were Cedar Riches, and the company name, which was Ridgewater's, and in his mind they connected cleanly. They stayed. Days turned into a week. My mother rearranged things in the kitchen. My sister-in-law posted about our family farm on social media and fielded congratulations from people who had no idea what they were congratulating. My brother walked the property in city shoes that were not made for gravel, pointing at equipment and describing what he would sell and what he would keep. On Canadian Thanksgiving weekend, my mother invited extended family. Aunts and uncles and cousins who hadn't visited since my father's funeral arrived with covered dishes, and the careful expressions of people who have been told there is a grievance that requires their presence. My mother had called them each personally. She had described her heartbreak. She had described my selfishness. She had made sure they arrived already believing most of what she wanted them to believe. 18 people sat around my dining table and ate food my kitchen had prepared, while my mother delivered a speech about my father's legacy and the ingratitude of daughters who put their own interests above their family. She cried. She was persuasive. My aunt put her hand on my arm and said that family was the only thing that lasted. I let my shoulders drop. I made my voice small and tired. I said I was exhausted from fighting people I loved, and that if signing the holding company over to my brother was what it took to have peace, I would do it. I would meet him at a lawyer's office the following Friday. They applauded. My brother raised his glass toward me. My sister-in-law stopped recording on her phone and started typing. I spent that week making certain that Cedar Ridge Organics Inc. was sealed and untouchable. I met with my lawyer on Thursday morning. I gave her the exact language I needed in section 3 of the transfer document and told her to make sure it was unambiguous. She read it over, looked at me once, and said she'd have it ready by 8 the next morning. The lawyer's office was on 8th Avenue. My brother arrived in a pickup truck he'd leased that week from a private lender in the city, using his incoming title as collateral for the loan. He parked it across 2 spaces. We sat in the boardroom. My lawyer read the document clause by clause. My brother drummed his fingers on the table during section 2. My sister-in-law took photographs of herself in the reflection of the window. When my lawyer reached the paragraph stating that the transferee assumed all outstanding liabilities, financial, regulatory, and environmental, attached to Ridgewater Holdings Inc. In perpetuity, my brother waved one hand and said he understood perfectly and could they please get to the signature page. I said, "Are you certain? Do you want me to explain exactly which liabilities we're referring to?" He told me I was stalling because I couldn't handle losing. He signed. I reached into my jacket pocket and placed a single item on the table, a small square metal tag, orange, the kind the Alberta energy regulator attaches to inactive wellheads for identification. A lease number was stamped into it. My brother looked at the tag, then at me. I told him that was the asset identifier for well number 3 on the Ridgewater property. I told him Ridgewater Holdings Inc. was the registered operator of record for 3 orphan-designated wells, with a combined AER remediation demand of $2.3 million. I told him the company he had just taken sole legal ownership of had outstanding enforcement orders under the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, and that AER prosecutors had been preparing for an operator prosecution for non-compliance with mandatory cleanup directives. I told him that Cedar Ridge Organics, the greenhouse, the farmland, the solar lease, all of it, existed under a completely separate corporation that he had never once asked to see the documentation for. The room was very quiet. I stood, smoothed my jacket, and walked out into the October morning. I drove back to my property, I made tea, I sat on the steps of the greenhouse and let myself breathe for the first time in months. The RCMP officers arrived at the Ridgewater site 38 minutes later. The AER Enforcement Division had been coordinating with them for the better part of a year, waiting for the registered operator to be unambiguously identified. My brother had signed that identification into existence an hour earlier in a notarized document witnessed by two people. He had driven there after leaving the lawyer's office, still telling himself that the greenhouse was just past the fence line, that some detail had been confused, that there was a rational explanation that would work out in his favor. What he found was 40 acres of contaminated scrubland, 3 concrete well pads, and an uncapped wellhead weeping hydrocarbons into the earth. What he found was every AER orange enforcement placard bolted to every pad, each bearing the name Ridgewater Holdings Inc., and now beneath that name, in the freshly updated provincial corporate registry, his own. My sister-in-law was standing beside the leased truck, filming a live video when the patrol vehicles turned down the access road. She stopped filming. My brother attempted to explain to the officers that there had been a serious misunderstanding. The lead officer referenced the transfer document filed that morning with the provincial registry. The enforcement notice was issued on-site. Charges under Section 112 of the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act were formally initiated the following week. The leased truck was flagged for review by the private lender within days, once they discovered that the corporate title pledged as collateral was a $2.3 million liability rather than a $4.2 million productive asset. It was recovered. My mother spent the months that followed trying to help him fight it. She hired lawyers. She took out lines of credit. She remortgaged her house in Calgary. None of it was enough to unwind a signed legal document, 3 years of AER enforcement correspondence, and the kind of paper trail that accumulates when a corporation ignores regulatory orders across multiple calendar years. My brother was found liable under provincial statute. The financial penalties and mandatory cost-sharing orders dismantled what remained of his financial life in a thorough and final way. My sister-in-law filed for separation before the proceedings concluded. She posted about it publicly and framed it as an act of self-preservation. Her followers were largely supportive. She moved back to Calgary and got on with things. The condo was eventually taken by the bank to satisfy the equity line my brother had drawn against it. My mother lost her house to the debt she accumulated trying to save him. She lives now in a subsidized residence in the southeast part of the city. I have not visited her. I have no plans to. It has been almost a year since the October, when 18 members of my extended family sat at my table and told me that keeping what I had built was the same as stealing it. Cedar Ridge Organics has expanded into a second greenhouse bay. We supply 8 restaurant accounts across Alberta and British Columbia. The solar lease was renewed at an increased rate. Greta was promoted to operations director. I hired a second scientist who is better than I was at her age. On most mornings, I drink my tea on the east steps of the main building while the light comes up over the river valley. From there, if I look west, I can just make out across the scrubland property the orange AER identification placards still mounted on the Ridgewater wellheads. The remediation is underway. It is slow and expensive and loud some days. It is no longer my problem. I have a small group of people I eat dinner with on Sunday evenings. We cook together, we talk about our weeks, and no one has ever once asked me to make myself smaller so they could feel larger. I spent most of my life believing that family meant you had no right to set down what they handed you, no matter how heavy it was or how deliberately it had been chosen for you. I know better now. Patience is not the same thing as weakness. Silence is not the same thing as giving in. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait, quietly, carefully, and without once letting them see you smile, until the people who underestimated you are holding the pen. My name is Cara. I am 29 years old. I am the sole director of Cedar Ridge Organics Inc., and I built every square foot of it myself. If this story found you at the right moment, if you have ever been handed the version of the inheritance nobody else wanted, the burden disguised as a gift, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Subscribe if you believe that walking away from people who tried to use you is not a betrayal. It is the most honest thing you can do. Your peace is not something you owe to anyone who has never tried to protect it.